My name is Juan Muñiz with AgSafe, and today we are covering selecting personal protective equipment, also referred to as PPE. AgSafe's disclaimer: the content of today's session is based on publicly available information. Such information is subject to change without notice, may be incomplete or condensed. Except where otherwise indicated, the information provided is based on matters as they exist as of the date of presentation. Such information is provided as general information on the topics presented. Nothing presented today constitutes legal advice or opinion to participants or others attending or reviewing this material, and is not a substitute for professional services. Every situation is different and subject to legislative activity and administrative or judicial changes in the law. You should also note that the views or opinions expressed by the presenters do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of AgSafe. This session will cover the following learning objectives: how to identify the required personal protective equipment, identification of the personal protective equipment required for specific tasks, and how handlers wear and care for the PPE. You may be asking yourself, well, what is considered PPE? For now, just look at the examples we have here and consider that personal protective equipment can range from gloves, eye protection such as goggles, respirators, hats, long sleeve shirts, long pants, and shoes or boots, and that this protective equipment, protective clothing is intended to protect us from exposure through the main routes of entry. That is eyes, nose, mouth, and skin. We will define this in more detail in the next few slides. How do you identify the required PPE? The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, sets the requirements for pesticide labels in the commercial agriculture sector under Title 40, Code of Federal Regulations, Section 156. And there are many requirements. However, we have listed a few of the important ones that are generally covered under the Worker Protection Standard for handlers. And these include the sections that require them to place a signal word on the label. They must have a product name. They must cover information regarding first aid procedures. Should someone become exposed, they should also have basic directions for use of the product. They have a section on precautionary statements, which is the focus for this section, along with directions for use. They also have label required personal protective equipment for handlers and other users. They also have a section regarding the re-entry interval, or REI. It specifies the amount of time that people should stay out post-application. It also has a section designated for user safety recommendations. They must have a chemical name, and they also have information on formulations. Once again, for our purpose, we will focus on the precautionary statements section, which is where we will find most of the PPE for most of the tasks, with one exception, which will be covered in the directions for use. How do you identify the required PPE? As I mentioned earlier, the precautionary statements will identify that for us, and it also identifies 3 primary hazards. The first one is hazards to people and animals. The second hazard is environmental hazards, which mention any concerns regarding environmental hazards, such as damage to waterways, um, damage to honeybees or other sensitive areas, maybe even air contamination. And they also have the third physical hazards, which will identify things such as flammability, reactivity, and explosive potential. So we will focus on the first hazard, which is hazards to people and animals. And under that section, it will have information on how to protect from those hazards. It will have personal protective equipment to wear while handling containers, mixing, loading, and applying this product or any labeled product. It'll also have information on why the pesticide is hazardous and the adverse effects should we become exposed while using this product. As a general tip, we should remember that as handlers, our duty is to protect people, property, and environment. Who is considered a handler? A pesticide handler is generally defined as any person who mixes, loads, applies, or assists with the application of pesticides or handles open containers. This also includes those involved in tasks such as cleaning, adjusting, or repairing equipment that has been used for pesticide application. 3 of the most often overlooked people that are or users that are considered handlers are assistants, anyone assisting with an application, and scouts. Scouts that are helping PCAs are usually overlooked, but they are also defined as handlers. And mechanics or people maintaining or cleaning equipment are also considered handlers. Now let's look at the precautionary statement section closer. In this section, you will see that it'll give us information for handler required PPE and PPE for other users. As we mentioned earlier, precautionary statements has information on hazards to human and domestic animals. And if you look closer here, it actually will tell you details of the hazards. If you look at that section, it says contains petroleum distillate. May be fatal if swallowed. Causes substantial but temporary eye injury. Do not get into the eyes or on clothing. Avoid contact with the skin. Prolonged or frequent repeated skin contact may cause allergic reactions. And then it goes on to tell us how to protect ourselves. Wash thoroughly with soap and water after handling and before eating, drinking, chewing gum, using tobacco, and using the toilet. Remove and wash contaminated clothing before reuse. Now, directly below that is where we see the specific personal protective equipment. And it has other information there about enclosed systems, closed cabs, aircrafts, gives you a lot of other details, but we're focused more on the sections where it talks about handlers. Handlers who may be exposed to the dilute through application or tasks must wear long sleeve shirts and long pants, chemical resistant gloves of a material that is barrier laminate or Viton, and it must be 14 mils thick or thicker. Shoes plus socks and protective eyewear, such as goggles, face shield, or safety glasses. So this first section says if you are exposed to dilute, that means it's already in a diluted form, and typically that is something that can indicate that is intended for applicators. So this is section speaking to applicators. Handlers who may be exposed to the concentrate through mixing, loading, application, or other tasks must wear the following. So here the key word is concentrate. That means you're handling concentrated products. So this usually indicates, right, the mixers and loaders, um, and not the applicators. Generally, they're not handling concentrated products, although they can. So this section is for mixers and loaders. They must wear long sleeve shirt, chemical resistant gloves, again of barrier laminate or Viton, and must be 14 millimeters thick or thicker, plus shoes and socks, protective eyewear. Again, this is all similar to the applicator. The only difference is they've added the instructions here to discard clothing and other absorbent materials that have been drenched or heavily contaminated with this product's concentrate. Do not reuse them. Follow manufacturer's instructions for cleaning, maintaining of PPE. If no such instructions for washables, use detergent and hot water. Keep and wash PPE separately from other laundry. So it just gives you a few more details regarding care for mixers and loaders who may come in contact with concentrated materials, and there may be chances of spill and contamination with concentrated materials, so it gives you the extra information there. Now, I mentioned there was one other person or one other user that we may need to look for personal protective equipment, and that is found in the directions for use section. If you look further in the label, after precautionary statements, you will see, and further down in the label, you will see directions for use. And within that section, you will see a section that is usually marked agricultural use requirements. So in those directions, you will find any PPE for early entry workers. These workers would enter that area post application for unforeseen and essential needs only. In this case, if you look in agricultural use on the bottom corner, it says, do not enter or allow worker entry into treated areas during the restricted entry interval of 12 hours. So within those 12 hours, we're supposed to stay out unless you have an unforeseen or essential use. And then it says PPE required for early entry. That would be the early entry workers to treated areas that is permitted under the worker protection standard and that involves contact with anything that has been treated, such as plants, oil, soil, or water, that means that we must wear these following items: chemical coveralls, chemical resistant gloves, barrier laminate or Viton greater than 14 mils, shoes plus socks, and protective eyewear such as goggles, face shield, and safety glasses. So that is what you would wear if you had an unforeseen and essential needs to enter that block during that 12-hour re-entry interval. The only two items that come to mind that would be unforeseen and essential, there may be others, but the most common are a leak in the irrigation system. That would be unforeseen and essential to protecting that commodity. The second would be a outbreak of some sort of infestation, and maybe needing to go in there with your scout or the PCA to determine how to mitigate that infestation. So they would have to use, at the bare minimum, this early entry protection itemized here on the label. And there are other details uh, related to early entry workers. I'm not going to go over the entire reg, but basically there are some limitations, right? They must go in uh, only 4 hours, usually after the application have elapsed. They also must be limited to 8 hours during a work period, and they must work if they are not handlers or applicators. If they're just laborers, then they are restricted to their activities where they are only exposed to in their lower extremities from their knees down, so their feet and lower legs, and from the elbows to their hands. Here are some sample labels so that we could see the way PPE or the different ways PPE is listed on these labels. The one on your left is Warrior 2. The one on your right is taken from Prow H2O labels, and these are commonly used products in the almond industry. You see the precautionary statement. Right below it, again, you'll see the hazards to humans and domestic animals. So we would make sure that we look through all that. And I draw your attention to the personal protective equipment on the left label, right in the middle. It says some materials that are chemical resistant to this product are listed below. If you want more options, follow the instructions for category G on an EPA chemical resistance category selection chart. And if you look further here, applicators and other handlers must wear long sleeve shirt and long pants, chemical resistant gloves, and a category G mentioned again, such as barrier laminate or Biton, greater than or equal to 14 millimeters thick, shoes plus socks, and protective eyewear. So here they tell us that they must be chemical resistant. They also mention category G, and they even give us some examples of the materials and thickness. Okay, usually they may only give you the materials and thickness, or they may just say category G, and then you have to look it up in these tools such as the EPA chemical and on the EPA website, or there's another tool on the next slide that we can show you how to decipher that. For now, let's look at the Prow H2O label on the right and look at the same thing. Precautionary statements, hazard to humans and animals on the top. And this one is shorter, so we can read it here. Caution, it says causes moderate eye irritation, harmful if swallowed or absorbed through the skin, avoid contact with skin, eyes, or clothing. So there's some of the hazards to humans and animals. And then the personal protective equipment section says applicators and other users, other handlers must wear long sleeve shirt and long pants, chemical resistant gloves, including barrier laminate, butyl rubber, greater or equal to 14 mils, nitrile rubber, greater or equal to 14 mils, neoprene rubber, greater or equal to 14 mils, natural rubber, greater or equal to 14 mils, polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride greater than 14 mils, or Biton greater than 14 mils, greater or equal to 14 mils, plus shoes and socks. So as you can see, this one only labeled a bunch of different types of rubbers, all of them specifying the thickness must be greater or equal to 14 mils. And in that case, if you have those gloves available, then you can just select those and you would be in compliance. If you didn't have those and you wanted to look up category G, you can go to the EPA website, or you can look here in this slide under the California Department of Pesticide Regulations. They have a glove selection key. And so if you recall, category G was mentioned on this selection key. If you look on the left, it says label code. That is what they're referring to as a category. These are the categories. So if you find G, that's what they mentioned earlier. Category G is referred to here as code G. If you look over to the right, there's a code 1 and 8. those are the approved materials of the glove, of category G glove. And then if you look further to the right, the material codes are listed 1 through 8. So in this case, category G means 1, laminate. They must be of a laminate material, or 8, which is Viton. And that is what they mentioned on the label, on the previous label. If you look at the note below, it says all but laminate and polyethylene must be 14 mils or thicker. So that means that if you had a category that allowed all of these categories, then you could use any of these that were 14 mils or thicker, with the exception of laminate or polyethylene, which would not require them to be 14 mils. As long as they're made from those materials, they would be acceptable. But in our case, for the previous label, it just says 1 or 8. So you can only use laminate or Viton. So that means, according to this note, that the laminate, right, does not have to be 14 mils or thicker. But again, remember that the label said that they had to be laminate or Viton greater or equal to 14 mils. So let's not get confused. Although this label says that it does not have to be, remember that we always refer back or defer back to the label. The label is the law, and so if you would have to make sure that you followed the label. If it says laminate and Viton of 14 mils or greater, then that's what you would have to use to technically be in compliance. If it did not specify the thickness, then you would be able to follow this chart and you would be in compliance, whatever laminate material you had, along with Viton of greater than 14, equal to or greater than 14 mils. Okay, early entry restrictions. So early entry employees may not enter if specified on the pesticide product label, and provided that the employer assures the following. Okay, so early entry employees may enter only if specified on the label, and if the employer assures that the employees are entering to perform pesticide handling activities. So that means that the pesticide handlers or applicators are performing something related to that application. Okay, they are always allowed to go in there as long as they're using the proper protection. The other thing that employers must assure is that employees have no contact with the treated surfaces such as plants, soil, air, irrigation water, or standing water such as drainage ditches or puddles, and that it's an unforeseen short-term and limited contact activity. Again, by definition, we said early entry workers could only go in there if it's an unforeseen activity, an essential activity. And there's other requirements. Again, we're not going to go into depth with those, but just remember that in contact, where is it? The limited contact activities, we did touch on the fact that it has to be the lower extremities from the knees down and from the elbows to the hands, are where we have to be careful that we only contact those areas while we're conducting any labor in that um, treated area. Debrief. Employers should train employees on when, what, and how of PPE. The label helps workers identify the specific PPE required for use during specific tasks, such as mixing, loading, applying, or early entry. What PPE is required for specific tasks? What is PPE? We covered some general items that were considered PPE in an earlier section. For the formal definition for this section is personal protective equipment is clothing, for example, gloves, rubber boots, or devices, for example, respirators, safety goggles, worn by workers to protect against hazardous environments. So as you can see, we have further defined the type of clothing, the levels of protection, the specific materials. It elevates all this clothing or coverings above and beyond your everyday work attire. So we want to make sure that we understand what is not considered PPE is our standard work attire. Okay, so long sleeve shirts, long pants, closed toe shoes, and socks, although they do serve as a barrier and do help provide some protection, it is not normally included for most regulatory purposes as PPE. Okay, so please note that although it is listed in some of the pesticide labels under the PPE uh, sections or under the personal protective equipment requirements, in California, if these items above are the only items mentioned under the PPE section of the label, then users must also wear eyewear and gloves in addition to your basic work attire. So what PPE is required for specific tasks? Okay, we covered a little bit on gloves earlier, so we need to learn to distinguish the following three types of PPE, and these are typically covered under the codes. For the gloves, you have the 3 CCR 6738. For respirators, you have 3 CCR 6739. And for all other body coverings, such as suits, eye protection, or boots, they fall under section under Title 3 of the CCR 6738. Okay, so they the reason we've separated them in this way is because usually gloves and respirators are they have their own line item in the label under PPE, and then all the other items are kind of just mentioned um, together. Okay, and that's usually because of the different requirements, right? We mentioned already the thickness, material type, right? For them to be chemical resistant, right? Waterproof or water resistant. For respirators, we mentioned already several different types. We're not going to get into the detail, but they also have a lot of details for specific type of respirators depending on the label and on the task. Okay, so gloves, again, we reviewed this in more detail earlier, but basically we just need to know that there are different types of acceptable materials and specifications for gloves, and we need to know where to find those, right? And we showed earlier the California Department of uh, Pesticide Regulations, along with the EPA, are your source for information on specific types of gloves and materials. Okay, so uh, what are the accepted materials and specs for gloves during pesticide application? Well, the answer is if reusable gloves are used, make sure they are of the same material specified on the label as the disposable gloves. Chemical resistant gloves must be indicated by the label. And again, I refer you back to the California Department of Pesticide Regulation category selection key for gloves. Okay, now gloves, the chemical resistance requires a little more information. So just keep in mind that chemical resistant gloves are not totally chemical proof, just like anything else. Nothing is 100%. So remember that rule. Solvents will eventually penetrate the glove over time. So the longer that chemical resistant glove is exposed to that, whatever that product is, that pesticide, depending on its composition, it will start to penetrate, or in some cases, break down the glove. Okay, so the thicker the glove, the more resistant it is to solvents. And that is why you have those specific thicknesses depending on the material types. Okay, so the only, there's only one exception where you can use a glove of the same material if you need your fine motor skills and dexterity for some task. Then you may wear a thinner glove of the same material specified on the label, but you can only use it for a maximum of 15 minutes, and then they must be discarded. Other than that, you must always wear the gloves indicated on the label and the correct thickness. Okay, so continuing with the gloves conversation, specifically Title 3, California Code of Regulations 6738.3. Employers shall assure that employees wear appropriate chemical resistant gloves when required, and that under further section D, separable glove liners. If your gloves come with inserts, any kind of lining of that glove that are removable, right? They're allowed unless they are expressly forbidden by the label. And then the liners must not extend beyond the cuff of the glove. Contaminated liners must be removed immediately, and all liners must be disposed at the end of the day. And then if you look further in section 1, D1, it mentions no flocked gloves. That means the flocking refers to the built-in absorbable material linings that are permanently affixed to the gloves. So those are not allowed. Respirators. What is the requirement for selecting pesticide respirators? And the answer is the correct respirator selection is based on the product label requirements of the pesticides. Steps to select the respirators are: 1, per the PPE label, per the PPE per the label. 2, respirators come in 2 types. And 3, proper filter media. They have either cartridges or canisters, depending on whether it's a organic canister requirement, or whether it's organic cartridge, or whether it's canisters, usually for fumigants. And filter types, which we mentioned earlier, the NPR or high efficiency filters, filter media. And 4, the protective barrier between user and contaminant can be loose fitting or tight fitting. Levels of respirator protection: homemade masks or surgical masks. Now, homemade masks are just used for illustration or for explanation, so that we are talking about the surgical type masks that are loose fitting. There aren't any homemade masks that are approved for use. So again, I'm just using it for reference so that we understand that it's the surgical loose fitting masks, typical of your homemade mask that we saw during COVID period. That is the lower level of protection. Surgical masks and N95s and those type of masks are the lowest protection. Then you go on to number 2 is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, also referred to as NEOSH, approved particulate filtering respirators would be a little higher protection. And 3, air purifying and atmosphere supplying respirators, So those NIOSH approved particulate filtering respirator classifications, there are 10 different classes of those types of filtering respirators. These types of respirators use filters to remove particulates from the air that is breathed through them. The N, R, and P designations refer to the filter's resistance to oil. And the types of filtering masks. Again, NIOSH approved particulate filtering respirator classifications. We touched on that earlier, right? That if you read across here, N95, N99, N100, that refers to the level of filtering. 95% of the filtering, if you look across, right? 95 refers to the N95, 99% refers to the N99, and the N100 filters 99.97% of airborne particulates. The N means that it's not resistant to oil. And if you look across, down and across, you would find that the R is somewhat resistant, but the same filtering capabilities. The P is strongly resistant to oil, but it's also filters the same amount as the other masks. And then last here, you have the high efficiency particulate air filter. And if you read across, it gives you more details on that. And the types of respirators, we said there was two types, the air purifying and the atmosphere supplying respirators. Okay, and under those you have positive or negative pressure, tight or loose fitting, continuous supply, demand or pressure demand, half or full mask. And you might ask yourself, what is important in selecting the appropriate one? Typically, it's the type and the concentration of airborne contaminant and the comfort are the most important in selecting a appropriate respirator. Types of respirators continued. Continuous flow means air is supplied via an airline. Pressure demand provides the highest protection and allows air to the mask at inhalation. So every time that we need to take a breath, the system is designed to let that small amount of air into our mask. And it accomplishes that by keeping a positive pressure in the mask at all times. Demand supplied air is like pressure demand. However, it does not maintain a positive pressure in the mask. Body coverings, PPE. So body coverings, again, refers to all the other items outside of the the gloves and the respirator. So any type of suits or coveralls, overalls, eye protection, boots, aprons, and hoods, along with face shields and that type of eye protection, goggles and safety glasses. And then body coverings include eye protection, suits, apron, and boots, which are usually mentioned as separate items on the label and apart from the glove specs and the respirator specifications. Coveralls, aprons, suits. Employers shall assure that employees wear coveralls when handling Category 1 or signal word danger, or Category 2 with signal word warning, pesticides. This does not apply to fumigants unless otherwise required by the label. Employers shall assure that employees wear chemical-resistant apron when required and chemical-resistant coveralls or suits when required. And then note chemical-resistant materials as in glove requirements earlier. So basically, if any of these other aprons or coveralls mention chemical resistant, there are going to be some requirements for them to be made of specific materials, certain thicknesses. So make sure that you look into that proper materials for your task and per the label. These are some examples of aprons, coveralls, and suits. And So you see there are different types of aprons. You see this dark one, you see they're usually rubber, and you definitely don't want to use leather or other cloth aprons for um, any handling activities. But again, your label is going to specify the type and material. And then you could see there's different types of overalls and coveralls, suits, all these different Tyvek suits. And they're all made again of different materials. So you need to look into that. One note of concern is most of these body coverings are made of some thick materials, and heat illness is always a concern. And so you need to make sure you make arrangements so you're not wearing any of these items when the temperature is 85 or higher. Eye protection. Eye protection will have ANSI approved models, while suits and aprons will be specified by type of material, waterproof, chemical resistance, etc. And ANSI is American National Standard for Occupational and Educational um, Personal Eye and Face Protection Devices. So it's the American National Standard. Uh, it's a standard used for the eye protection. Most it must be ANSI Z87.1-2010 compliant. And all that means is that it must have a brow and temple protection, and they must be impact resistant. So there's the minimum requirements. There are some minimum requirements to meet these under this ANSI standard. And if no specific type of eyewear is specified on the label, then you must use ANSI compliance items such as safety glasses, brow and temple protection, and impact resistant, and goggles or face shield, or combination of those that are ANSI approved. So again, ANSI is American National Standards Institute. It's a standard for safety glasses, and it is ANSI 787.1. That's what it's usually referred to. This standard establishes the criteria for the design, construction, testing, and the use of eye protection devices, including safety glasses to protect against impact, non-ionizing radiation, and chemical exposures in workplaces and other hazardous environments. So the easiest way to note these is when you um, to understand that they meet the ANSI Z87.1 standard. If you look at the frame or the lens, they will usually be stamped with the Z87 or with a Z87 plus. That means that at the very least they meet the ANSI standard, or the plus means that it exceeds that standard. Okay, and so that means that those will all meet or exceed the ANSI standard. And here's the samples of the different types of eye protection. But again, you must check that they're ANSI approved. And the way you see that is they have to have that number stamped on the frame on the inside somewhere, or on the lens themselves. So you must look for that stamp to make sure that they truly do meet the brow and side protection along with the impact. Continuing with eye protection, employers shall assure that employees wear protective eyewear that provides brow and temple protection conforming to the curvature of the face. And that falls under 3 CCR 6738.2, Section C. NEOSH approved full face respirator satisfies the eye protection equipment. And D, prescriptive eyewear may not interfere with fit, function, or function of the protective eyewear. That means that if you're wearing any of the equipment, the goggles, your eye prescription must fit within those goggles or that face shield. body covering limitations. Materials should be those approved on the label to obtain proper protection and avoid PPE deterioration and failure. Fit is essential for most PPE to avoid other PPE creating other exposure, danger, or other safety concerns. Technique for proper don and doff and wear should be followed for maximum utility of the PPE. Maintenance and care should be planned for and scheduled for all PPE. And modifications destroy the PPE and will not properly protect the user as intended by the manufacturer. Under no circumstances should PPE be modified without proper approval by the manufacturers. Okay, so the technique for proper putting on and taking off of the PPE. So the technique is if you're wearing a Tyvek suit, to wear the Tyvek outside of your boots, if not equipped with the booties or the boot leggings. Wear gloves outside of the Tyvek if working overhead, and wear the Tyveks inside if working in lower areas. Remove and wash off as much before starting to remove any PPE. So again, wear the gloves on the outside when working overhead and on the inside of your Tyveks when working in lower areas, and then wash off any excess material first. And then once you wash off your gloves, at that point you could start removing wash off as much of your residue off your entire suit and boots and gloves, and then you could start removing your items, waiting for your gloves to be the last items to remove. And at that point there is a way that you stick a finger on the inside of the glove and you roll it out onto itself, and that would be the way to properly remove it. So in debrief of this section, the label identifies specific gloves, respirators, and body coverings required for each task. Gloves must be of specific materials and thicknesses and resistant to environments and chemicals as indicated on the label. Respirators are paired with cartridges and canisters based on the type of masks and systems used, and is also usually governed by the label. NIOSH standards must also be observed to secure the best protection. How workers wear and care for PPE. Proper work attire must be worn under protective suits and coveralls. The proper work attire includes long sleeve shirts, long pants, socks, and closed work shoes. To wear and care for PPE, follow these steps. 1, provide workers with a clean area away from contaminants to store clothing and unused PPE. Make sure the area is isolated and separate from pesticide storage areas or contaminated used PPE. 2, put on PPE at the start of every exposure period. Check for proper fit and function as needed, such as checking for positive and negative pressure for the respirators and checking Tyvek suits to make sure that zippers are properly working along with secondary seals. 3, remove PPE at the end of every exposure period. Make sure you have a proper staging area ahead of time for the thorough washing. 4, Prevent heat illness while wearing PPE. Avoid use above 80 degrees during the day and above 85 degrees during the night, unless you are using engineering controls such as cooling suits or other cooling equipment. 5, wash down and remove PPE following pesticide use and store properly, such as storing in a sealed container. Make sure it's accessible, it's clean, and it's in a dry place. Make sure to use the proper process for cleaning per the manufacturer and best practices. Care for PPE. Title 3 of the California Code of Regulations, Section 6738. Equipment must be inspected daily. Inspect for damage and wear before and after use. Gloves should be checked for cracks and tears. Protective suits, such as Tyvek, should be inspected for tears and malfunctioning seals. Safety eyewear should be inspected for scratches or broken parts. Respirators should be inspected for damaged seals and headbands. Boots should be inspected for cuts or holes. Heavily contaminated PPE shall be replaced. Store clean PPE in a specially designated pesticide-free area. Leather gloves used with phosphides shall be aerated for a minimum of 12 hours for cleaning. Care for PPE. Make sure PPE is used properly. Make sure that all body parts are shielded, such as your head, face, neck, trunk, arms, legs, and feet. They must be shielded from exposure while handling pesticides. Make sure that the personal protective equipment is durable and resistant to punctures and tears during normal use. Make sure that it is comfortable enough without restricting your movement. Care for PPE. Store and wash used PPE separately from other laundry and make sure it is dried properly. Most reusable PPE is best washed by hand for best results, although some can be machine washed, such as gloves and boots. Gloves may be placed inside of a mesh or a cloth bag and thrown into the washer. Dry boots and gloves in a well-ventilated area away from direct sunlight and any heat sources. Never allow contaminated PPE to be taken into workers' homes. If unavoidable, plan for the proper storage and cleaning. If a worker does not return to the headquarters, provide a sealable container for a worker to store contaminated equipment outside their home. To the left, you see sample sealed buckets, and there are other sealable containers that can be used along with plastic bags such as those pictured on the right. Washing PPE. Washing the chemical resistant clothing should be done immediately to prevent others from being exposed. Throw away any clothing that had been soaked in pesticides and throw away all single-use disposable chemical resistant clothing at the end of each work day. Change out of contaminated clothing at the work site if possible. Place contaminated clothing in a plastic bag until they can be washed. Washing work clothing. Use hot water and liquid laundry detergent. Machine wash your work clothing separately from your family's clothing, and make sure that you use the liquid detergent because it removes oil-based pesticides better than powdered detergents. Washing boots and gloves. Wash boots and gloves under running water to remove pesticide residue before you remove them. Use detergent mixed with water and a soft brush and rinse with clean water. At the end of each day, wash rubber gloves with soap and warm water. Inspect them for any damage and discard if you find any. Washing face shield and goggles. Should be washed after each use, including goggles, face shields, shielded safety glasses, respirator bodies, and face pieces. Take special care to avoid scratching eyepieces. Submerge them in warm water with soap. You can remove pasted residue by using a soft, wet cloth or a soft brush. Do not rub anti-fogging lenses since this reduces their effectiveness. Rinse well with clean water and air dry. Inspect goggles and face shields for scratches, cracks, and loss of headband elasticity. Care for PPE. Make sure the personnel maintaining or cleaning the PPE know what they are doing. Best to clean or wash your own PPE to inspect as you wash, besides your routine pre-planned scheduled maintenance. While you are washing, inspect the equipment. You should always inspect your respirator for wear and damage before using it each day, and again before cleaning it at the end of the day. Check headbands and replace as needed. Remove filters and replace gaskets if they are brittle, broken, or warped. Valve assemblies are essential parts of a cartridge respirator and must be in good working order. Have a plan for routine scheduled maintenance. When replacing parts on respirators, make sure to use only approved replacement parts for brand and model. Washing PPE. If you have a team of people that clean your equipment, make sure they are aware of dangers of the residue and how to protect themselves, such as using the proper gloves, apron, and proper ventilation. If the manufacturer does not provide detailed instructions on cleaning chemical-resistant items, follow the next steps. Items that do not lay flat may need to be washed twice, such as gloves, coveralls, and footwear. Turn inside out 2 times. Some chemical resistant items, such as heavy duty boots and rigid hats or helmets, can be washed by hand with hot water using a heavy liquid detergent. Cleaning respirators. After removing filters from usable cartridges, soak the facepiece, gasket, and valve parts in warm water and mild liquid detergent. Do not use abrasives or alcohol. Use a soft cloth or brush to remove residues and soak them in open water. Air dry any filters and avoid direct sunlight or heat. Follow manufacturer's recommendations for cartridge replacement. Do not try to clean disposable cartridge respirators. Remember, it is always best to have a scheduled regular maintenance besides your fast inspection during washing. They should be done seasonal, quarterly, yearly, or at any predetermined period that works for your organization. Proper removal of PPE. Wash off as much of exterior PPE with water. Wash the outside of the gloves with detergent and water. Start removing other PPE except for your eyewear and gloves. Dispose single-use items. Place reusable PPE in a bag or area for washing. The second to the last item to come off are the gloves. Make sure to use proper technique for removing. The proper technique involves using the thumb finger of one hand, inserting it into the cuff of the opposite glove, rolling it down into the hand and into itself, avoiding touching the working part of the glove, and repeating for the opposite hand. Wash your hands immediately before finally removing your eyewear. And during your thorough wash, make sure that you plan to use at least long gloves, eyewear, and proper apron or a suit. Check label requirements. Do not try to clean any disposable cartridge. If you remove your respirator between handling activities, follow these guides. First, wipe the respirator body and face piece with a clean cloth. Remove caps, if available, over the cartridges and canisters. Clean and replace. Seal the respirator in an airtight container, such as a Ziploc bag. This will prevent from impurities contaminating your equipment through normal exposure to air. Proper PPE storage. Boots and gloves. Make sure to store and dry boots and gloves in a plastic bag to prevent deterioration and contamination. Face shields and goggles. Make sure to store goggles and face shields in a paper bag. This is to protect the face shield and goggle sealing material from drying out. It should be stored in a paper bag to allow it to breathe, and then it could be stored in a bigger sealed container. Respirators should also be stored in a clean plastic bag. Again, make sure that the respirators and cartridges are sealed in separate bags, or that if you're putting them together, to be sealed together to keep cartridges from being contaminated. At that point, you can store items in a bigger sealable container. Debrief. Employees must be trained in how to put on and remove PPE at the start of every exposure period and at the end of every exposure period. How to properly wear the PPE for best protection during exposure tasks. Workers must also know any risks associated with wearing the PPE, such as heat illness risks associated with wearing these type of suits and protective coverings, any increased risk of increased heart rate, difficulties breathing, and any other known medical conditions or medications that could affect some of these risks. Remember that to check your equipment for proper fit and for any damage before use, and either repair or replace any damaged equipment, and to never modify any PPE unless it's approved by the manufacturer.